Rain pounded against the windshield in a relentless rhythm as Juliet Harper tightened her grip on the steering wheel. The wipers struggled to keep up with the downpour, their mechanical swish barely cutting through the torrent. Her shift at Austin Children's Hospital had stretched well past its intended end, and the exhaustion in her bones mirrored the dreary night outside. She adjusted her scarf to fight off the chill seeping through the cracks of her aging car and focused on the narrow, dimly lit road ahead. The streetlights flickered, casting faint halos on the wet asphalt. As Juliet rounded a bend, her headlights illuminated a car pulled over on the shoulder, its hazard lights flashing like a distress signal. She instinctively slowed, her nurse's instincts kicking in before logic could catch up. Pulling her car to a stop a few yards ahead, she grabbed her umbrella from the passenger seat and stepped into the storm. The man leaning against the disabled vehicle looked up as she approached. Drenched but calm, he appeared to be in his mid-30s with a scruffy jacket that looked too thin for the weather. His dark hair clung to his forehead, and his hands were stuffed into his pockets. "Need some help?" Juliet called out over the rain, her voice firm but friendly. The man gave her a faint smile, his expression equal parts gratitude and surprise. "I wouldn't want to trouble you. It's just a flat tire. I was about to call for roadside assistance." Juliet shook her head, waving away his concerns. "They'll take hours on a night like this. Let me help. It's faster." She crouched to inspect the tire, her nurse's practicality making short work of any hesitation. "Name's Dean," the man offered after a moment, as though realizing politeness demanded an introduction. "Dean Cross." "Juliet," she replied without looking up, her hands already working to retrieve the spare tire from his trunk. "Juliet Harper." Dean hesitated, as if processing her lack of caution. "You always stop to help stranded strangers?" Juliet smirked, glancing at him briefly. "Only the ones who look harmless enough." Dean chuckled softly, his breath visible in the cold air. "Fair point." Together they worked in relative silence, save for the occasional exchange of tools and instructions. Dean seemed capable but out of practice, fumbling slightly with the jack before Juliet took over with an ease that suggested experience. The rain didn't let up, soaking through Juliet's coat and plastering her auburn hair to her cheeks, but she hardly seemed to notice. "Do you do this often?" Dean asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. "Helping strangers on rainy nights?" Juliet tightened the lug nuts on the spare tire and straightened, brushing damp strands of hair from her face. "Not exactly, but I work at the children's hospital. Helping people is kind of in the job description." Dean's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "A nurse?" She nodded, not elaborating, and handed him the wrench. "All set. You're good to go." Dean took it but didn't immediately move. "Thank you, really. Not many people would stop, especially not in this weather." Juliet shrugged, brushing droplets from her coat. "You looked like you needed it. Just pay it forward sometime." He smiled at that, the kind of smile that lingered, though Juliet didn't notice. She waved him off and turned to head back to her car, her shoes squelching in the puddles. Before she could reach the door, Dean called after her. "Hey, Juliet?" She turned, eyebrows raised. "Be careful. The world needs more people like you." Juliet gave him a small smile before slipping into her car. As she drove off, the encounter began fading into the background of her thoughts, replaced by worries about work, bills, and the growing financial strain at the hospital. Still, something about the stranger stuck with her. A faint impression, like the ghost of a melody she couldn't quite place. The rain continued to fall in unrelenting sheets, drumming against the roof of Juliet's car as she navigated the winding road toward home. She cranked up the heat, shivering slightly in her damp clothes. The faint glow of her dashboard clock told her it was nearly midnight, but she knew she wouldn't find sleep easily. Thoughts of the hospital filled her mind, crowding out any lingering impressions of her encounter with Dean. The financial strain on Austin Children's Hospital had been growing for months, and Juliet had been feeling the pressure more than ever. The pediatric oncology ward, where she spent most of her shifts, was under threat of severe budget cuts. If the hospital couldn't secure funding soon, programs critical to the care of their young patients would be slashed, leaving families with few options. She clenched her jaw, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The thought of those children losing their lifelines was unbearable. Her apartment was a modest two-bedroom tucked into a quiet neighborhood on the city's edge. The building itself had seen better days, with peeling paint and creaky staircases, but it was home. Parking under a dimly lit street lamp, Juliet grabbed her bag and hurried inside, shaking off the cold as she locked the door behind her. The warmth of the apartment was a relief, but the silence felt heavier than usual. Dropping her bag on the counter, she moved to the small kitchen and set a kettle on the stove. As the water heated, her gaze drifted to the stack of hospital reports she'd brought home. Financial projections, funding proposals, and an updated list of patients currently undergoing treatment. It wasn't her job to worry about the hospital's budget. That fell on Dr. John Carter, the hospital's director. But Juliet couldn't help herself. She was too invested, too aware of how much the programs meant to the children and their families. Sitting at the table, she flipped through the reports, her eyes scanning the grim numbers. Her mind wandered to possible solutions, fundraisers, donation campaigns, anything to buy the ward more time. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention away from the papers. It was a text from Flora. Flora. Still awake? Got an idea for the fundraiser. Call me if you're not dead tired. Juliet smiled faintly. Flora had been her closest friend since nursing school, her eternal optimist even in the face of overwhelming challenges. Sliding her phone back onto the table, Juliet made a mental note to call her in the morning. Tonight, she needed rest if she was going to make it through another grueling shift. As she climbed into bed, the memory of Dean's face flickered in her mind, unbidden. His dark eyes, the quiet gratitude in his voice, the way he'd seemed so calm in the storm. There was something about him, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Shaking her head, Juliet dismissed the thought. She'd likely never see him again. People passed through her life all the time, and most were gone as quickly as they came. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. The next morning brought grey skies but no rain. Juliet arrived at the hospital early, as she often did, to check on her patients before the day officially began. The ward was already bustling with activity. Nurses exchanged updates at the central station, and the faint sound of cartoons played from the TVs in some of the children's rooms. Juliet greeted them with a warm smile as she made her rounds, the familiar rhythm of her routine helping to steady her thoughts. She was just finishing with a young patient, a boy named Caleb who was undergoing chemotherapy, when Dr. Carter approached. His expression was serious, as it often was these days, but there was a hint of urgency in his tone. "Juliet, do you have a moment?" he asked, glancing toward the hallway. "Of course." She followed him to a quieter corner near his office, bracing herself for bad news. Carter sighed, running a hand through his greying hair. "The board is meeting next week to finalize the budget cuts. If we don't find a way to bring in more funding, the oncology ward will be the first to go." Juliet's chest tightened. She'd known this was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud made it feel all the more real. "What can we do? There has to be something." Carter gave her a small, sad smile. "You've already been doing more than enough. But if you have any ideas for fundraisers or outreach, now would be the time to act." She nodded, her mind already racing. "I'll think of something. We'll make it work." As she returned to her rounds, Juliet felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. The lives of the children in this ward depended on her, on all of them, to fight for the resources they needed. She didn't know how, but she would find a way. And somewhere across town, in a quiet corner of a cafe, Dean Cross sat staring out at the overcast sky, a faint smile on his lips as he thought of the determined woman who had stopped to help him. His path and Juliet's were about to cross again, though neither of them could yet imagine just how deeply their lives would intertwine. The hospital hummed with a familiar mix of urgency and compassion as Juliet moved through the oncology ward, her focus sharp despite the weight of Dr. Carter's words still lingering in her mind. Children's laughter echoed faintly from one of the rooms, a testament to their resilience even in the face of illness. Juliet took a moment to center herself, drawing strength from the very patients she was fighting for. Her first stop was Caleb's room. The 8-year-old boy was propped up on his bed, a superhero coloring book in his lap and a half-finished drawing of a caped crusader in his hands. His bald head shone under the fluorescent lights, but his wide grin was undimmed by the challenges he faced. "Morning, Caleb," Juliet greeted, stepping into the room with a warm smile. "What's the mission today? Saving the world." Caleb grinned back, holding up his drawing. "I'm making a new superhero. He's called Captain Courage." "Captain Courage, huh?" Juliet leaned closer, pretending to scrutinize the drawing with exaggerated seriousness. "Looks like he's got the bravery part down. What's his superpower?" "He can make people feel better, even when they're really, really sick," Caleb said matter-of-factly, his innocent confidence striking a chord in Juliet's heart. "Sounds like a pretty amazing superhero to me," she replied softly, ruffling his blankets. "Keep working on him. The world needs heroes like that." After ensuring Caleb was comfortable and that his next treatment was scheduled, Juliet moved on to her other patients. Each child was a reminder of why she couldn't afford to let the oncology ward close. They deserved every chance, every ounce of hope the hospital could give them. By mid-morning, Juliet found herself back at the nurses' station, flipping through charts and catching up with Flora. Her friend leaned against the counter, sipping a cup of coffee as she studied Juliet's face. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" Flora said, raising an eyebrow. "Thinking about what?" Juliet asked, though the attempt at feigned ignorance was half-hearted. "The fundraiser." Flora set down her coffee and crossed her arms. "Don't deny it. I can see the wheels turning in that overworked brain of yours." Juliet sighed, leaning back against the counter. "I just don't know where to start. A bake sale isn't going to cut it this time. We need something big, something that will actually make an impact." "Well," Flora began, her tone playful, "lucky for you, I have a few ideas." Before Juliet could respond, Dot appeared, her ever-present clipboard tucked under her arm. The older woman had a knack for sensing when her input was needed, and today was no exception. "You two look like you're plotting something," Dot said, her sharp eyes darting between them. "And if it involves saving this ward, count me in." Juliet chuckled, grateful for their unwavering support. "Actually, we were just brainstorming. Flora thinks we need a big fundraiser, and I agree. The question is what?" Dot tapped her clipboard thoughtfully. "What about an auction? Something that will draw in people with deep pockets. We could gather donations from local businesses, maybe even some art or collectibles." Flora nodded enthusiastically. "I like it. And we could make it a whole event. A dinner maybe, with music. Something classy." Juliet hesitated, though the idea was already taking root in her mind. "It sounds ambitious. Do you really think we can pull it off?" Dot's gaze was steady, her voice firm. "If it means keeping this ward open, we'll make it happen." As Juliet listened to them discuss the logistics, a flicker of hope began to grow within her. The plan was far from solid, But it was a start, a way forward. For the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of possibility. As the day wore on, Juliet couldn't shake the feeling that they were up against impossible odds. But every time doubt crept in, she thought of Caleb and the other children who depended on the oncology ward for their treatments. This wasn't just about numbers or budgets, it was about lives. The realization steeled her resolve as she jotted down notes for the auction plan during her lunch break. By mid-afternoon, Juliet was making calls to local businesses to gauge interest in contributing to the event. She started small, cafes, bakeries, and local artists, and was surprised by the number of positive responses. Flora popped by the desk, holding a flyer mock-up she'd drafted during her own break. "Check this out," she said, sliding it across the counter. The design was simple but elegant, advertising a fundraising auction and dinner to benefit Austin Children's Hospital's oncology ward. "I figured we'd need something eye-catching to start spreading the word." Juliet examined the flyer, her lips curving into a faint smile. "It's perfect. Let's run it by Dr. Carter and get his approval." The rest of the shift passed in a blur of patient care and event planning. By the time Juliet finally packed up to leave, her mind buzzed with ideas, but exhaustion weighed heavily on her. As she walked out into the parking lot, she noticed a figure leaning casually against her car. Her steps faltered before recognition set in. Dean. He straightened as she approached, offering a sheepish smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Juliet raised an eyebrow, unsure whether to be amused or wary. "How did you find me?" "You mentioned the hospital last night," Dean admitted, shrugging slightly. "I wanted to stop by and say thanks again for your help. And, well, offer mine." "Your help?" Juliet asked, skepticism clear in her tone. Dean nodded, his expression earnest. "I heard you talking about needing funding. I might know a few people who could pitch in." Juliet stared at him, taken aback. There was something about his tone, confident but not arrogant, that made her pause. For a moment, she considered brushing him off, but then she remembered Dot's words earlier. "If it means keeping this ward open, we'll make it happen." "All right," she said cautiously, folding her arms. "I'm listening." Juliet stared at Dean, the rain-slicked parking lot illuminated by the dim streetlights overhead. His offer to help lingered in the air, heavy with both sincerity and mystery. She hesitated, her instincts warring with the practicality of her situation. The oncology ward was running out of time, and she couldn't afford to turn away potential allies, even if those allies came with unanswered questions. "All right," she said, her voice firm but cautious. "If you think you can help, we can talk, but don't make promises you can't keep." Dean's lips curved into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Fair enough. Do you have time now, or should I come back later?" Juliet glanced at her watch, her exhaustion from the long day pressing down on her. The idea of discussing anything at this hour was daunting, but urgency outweighed her fatigue. "There's a cafe a few blocks from here," she said. "We can talk there." 15 minutes later, they were seated at a corner table in a quiet diner, the smell of coffee and grilled food filling the air. Juliet wrapped her hands around a steaming mug, watching Dean over the rim as he sipped his black coffee with ease. Despite his casual demeanor, there was a sharpness in his gaze that she couldn't ignore. "So," she began, breaking the silence, "what exactly are you offering? And how do you know people who might want to donate to a children's hospital?" Dean leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Let's just say I've worked in circles where people have more money than they know what to do with. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that some of them will pay to feel good about themselves." Juliet frowned. "That doesn't exactly inspire confidence." Dean chuckled softly, shaking his head. "It's not as bad as it sounds. The point is, I can connect you with people who are willing to help. All I need is the pitch. What's the plan? She hesitated, glancing down at her cup. The idea of sharing her still fragile fundraiser plans with someone she barely knew felt risky, but she couldn't ignore the opportunity he presented. After a moment, she laid out the basics. The auction, the dinner, the goal of raising enough funds to keep the oncology ward open for another year. Dean listened intently, nodding at intervals. When she finished, he leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. It's a solid start, but you'll need more than just local support to reach your target. Juliet arched an eyebrow. And you think you can help with that? I know I can, he said simply. Give me a few days to make some calls. If I can deliver even half of what I think I can, you'll have more donors than you know what to do with. His confidence was disarming, and for a moment, Juliet wondered what kind of life he led that gave him such ease in promising solutions to monumental problems. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice softer now. We barely know each other. Dean's gaze dropped for a moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. Let's just say I've seen what it's like when people don't have access to the care they need. If I can do something to prevent that for these kids, then I will. The honesty in his tone left her momentarily speechless. Juliet nodded slowly, the smallest flicker of trust beginning to form. All right, she said at last, but don't make me regret this. Dean gave a small nod, accepting her cautious agreement without pushing further. They sat in silence for a moment, the soft hum of the diner's overhead lights filling the quiet space between them. Juliet glanced out the window, watching the rain taper into a light drizzle. Her mind raced with conflicting thoughts, relief that someone was willing to help, unease about the mystery surrounding Dean, and an undercurrent of hope she hadn't felt in days. All right, she said finally, breaking the stillness. If you think you can bring in donors, I'll trust you for now, but I'll need updates, proof that this is going somewhere. Dean's lips twitched in a faint smile, as if he expected no less. Fair deal. I'll keep you in the loop. They exchanged contact information before leaving the cafe, and as Juliet slid into her car, she couldn't help but feel the odd weight of their encounter. Dean Cross wasn't just an ordinary man, of that she was sure, but the urgency of the oncology ward's situation left her little room to dwell on her suspicions. For now she'd take whatever help she could get. The next day at the hospital, Juliet shared the progress with Flora and Dot as they met at the nurses' station. Flora, as always, was quick to latch onto the silver lining. See, things are already moving, Flora said brightly, her optimism almost contagious. This guy, Dean, he sounds like he knows what he's doing. Juliet wasn't quite as convinced. Maybe. But I'm not ready to throw all our hopes into his hands just yet. We need to keep working on our end too. Dot nodded, her expression thoughtful. Smart. Always have a backup plan. So, what's next? We need to secure some solid auction items, Juliet replied, pulling out a list she'd started drafting. Something that will actually draw attention. Art, collectibles, maybe even services like spa packages or private chef dinners. Flora grinned. Leave that to me. I've got connections at a few local galleries, and I might be able to wrangle a couple of business owners into contributing. And I'll handle the calls to the restaurants, Dot added. We'll need catering for the dinner anyway, so it's a good chance to ask for donations. Juliet felt a surge of gratitude for her friend's enthusiasm. The task ahead still loomed large, but their support made it seem a little more manageable. All right, she said, with a small smile. Let's make this happen. Over the next few days, the fundraiser began to take shape. Flora secured commitments from 2 local artists, both of whom agreed to donate pieces for the auction. Dot worked her magic with the restaurant owners, arranging not only catering, but also a series of gift certificates for the auction. Even Miguel, the journalist, chipped in by promising to write a piece promoting the event. But as the team worked tirelessly, Juliet found herself checking her phone more often than she wanted to admit. Dean's promised updates were sparse, just brief texts confirming progress without much detail. It was enough to keep her on edge, though she tried to convince herself it was simply her natural skepticism. Late one evening, as Juliet was packing up her things after another long shift, her phone buzzed. The message was short but intriguing. "I've secured a major donor. Can we meet tomorrow to discuss?" Juliet stared at the screen, her heart skipping a beat. A major donor? If Dean was telling the truth, this could be the break they needed. But with that hope came a gnawing question she couldn't shake. Just who exactly was Dean Cross? Juliet sat in the corner booth of the same cafe where she had first discussed the fundraiser with Dean. The morning light filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow on the table where her notebook and pen lay. Despite the coffee in front of her, her hands were wrapped around her phone, waiting for Dean's arrival. His text from the previous evening had been short but tantalizing. A major donor secured. The bell over the door jingled, and Juliet looked up to see Dean walking in. He was dressed in a casual blazer over a crisp shirt, a stark contrast to the scruffy look he'd sported the night they met. He gave her a small nod before heading to the table, sliding into the seat across from her. "Morning," he said with a faint smile, his tone light but purposeful. "Thanks for meeting so early." Juliet waved off his thanks. "If you've got good news, I'll make time. So, what's the update?" Dean leaned forward slightly, his demeanor shifting to something more serious. "I've reached out to a few people I know. Well, people I used to work with. And one of them has agreed to sponsor the fundraiser." Juliet blinked, her surprise evident. "Sponsor? As in covering the costs?" "Exactly. They'll take care of the venue, catering, and any other expenses. That means every dollar raised during the auction will go straight to the oncology ward." The weight of his words hit Juliet immediately. The sponsorship would relieve an enormous financial burden, allowing the team to focus on the auction itself. For the first time, she felt like they might actually pull this off. "That's incredible. Who is it?" Dean hesitated for a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but Juliet caught it. "Let's just say they prefer to remain anonymous. They're not big on public recognition." Her brows knit together in mild suspicion, but she decided not to press the issue. At least, not yet. The ward's survival was more important than her curiosity about Dean's connections. "All right. If they want to stay in the background, that's fine. I just hope this isn't too good to be true." "It's not," Dean said firmly, his gaze steady. "I wouldn't bring this to you if it wasn't solid." Juliet nodded, feeling a small sense of relief. "Okay, let's focus on the next steps. With the venue and catering covered, we need to finalize the auction items and start spreading the word." Dean reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notepad. "I've been thinking about that. If we can secure a few high-profile items or experiences, something unique that grabs attention, it'll draw in a bigger crowd." "Like what?" Juliet asked, intrigued. "Exclusive access to something people can't buy off the shelf. Maybe a private dinner with a renowned chef, tickets to an event with backstage passes, or even a weekend stay at a luxury retreat." Juliet tilted her head, considering his suggestions. They were ambitious, but with the right execution, they could make the auction stand out. "Those are good ideas. We've already got some art pieces and gift certificates, but something like that could really elevate the event." Dean smiled, jotting a few notes in his pad. "I'll reach out to some contacts and see what I can line up. Meanwhile, you keep working your magic with the local donors. Deal?" "Deal," Juliet said, extending her hand. Dean clasped it briefly, his grip warm and reassuring. For the first time since this effort began, she felt like they were truly gaining momentum. The rest of the day unfolded in a flurry of calls and meetings. Juliet's first stop was the hospital, where she shared the news about the sponsor with Flora and Dot. Both women reacted with a mix of excitement and disbelief. "A full sponsorship," Flora exclaimed, practically bouncing on her heels. "That's huge! Who's behind it?" "Anonymous donor," Juliet replied, her tone measured. "Dean says they want to stay out of the spotlight." Dot narrowed her eyes thoughtfully. "That's unusual. Most big donors like their names attached to these kinds of things. But if it's legitimate, we won't look a gift horse in the mouth." Juliet nodded. "Exactly. It's a massive step forward, but we still have work to do. Dean's helping secure some unique auction items. In the meantime, we need to focus on spreading the word and making sure we get as many attendees as possible." Flora grabbed a notepad, her enthusiasm undimmed. "I'll start calling local businesses and see if we can get them to display flyers, maybe even sponsor a few seats at the dinner." "And I'll reach out to the parents' network," Dot added. "Many of them might want to attend or help spread the word. Their stories could also add a personal touch to the event." Juliet felt a renewed sense of purpose as the three of them divided the tasks. With every passing day, the fundraiser felt less like an uphill battle and more like a real possibility. Later that evening, Juliet sat in her living room, reviewing the growing list of confirmed auction items. Flora's connections had come through with 2 additional art pieces, and Dot had secured a donation of a luxury spa package. Dean's texts had been sporadic throughout the day, each one adding another layer of intrigue to his mysterious network. A private dinner with a renowned chef, VIP tickets to a sold-out concert, even a weekend getaway at a secluded estate. The items were impressive, far beyond what Juliet had hoped for. But as the list grew, so did her questions. Who exactly were these people willing to contribute so generously? And how did Dean have such easy access to them? As if summoned by her thoughts, her phone buzzed with another text from him. "Can we meet tomorrow?" "There's something else I need to discuss." Juliet stared at the screen, a mix of curiosity and unease stirring within her. Dean's involvement had been invaluable, but the more he contributed, the harder it was to ignore the feeling that there was more to his story than he was letting on. The next morning, Juliet met Dean at a quiet cafe on the edge of downtown. He was already seated when she arrived, a cup of coffee in front of him and his ever-present notepad by his side. "Good to see you," Dean greeted, his tone warm but businesslike. "I wanted to go over a few last details for the auction." Juliet slid into the seat across from him, setting down her bag. "All right, let's hear it." Dean leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. "I've been able to secure a few more big-ticket items, but I need your help with something. I think we should feature some of the children from the oncology ward, share their stories during the event." Juliet froze, her brow furrowing. "You mean, have them speak?" "Not necessarily," Dean clarified. "We could use photos, videos, or even letters from their parents. Something to remind the attendees why this fundraiser matters. We need to make it personal." Juliet's initial resistance softened as she considered his point. He was right. The children were the heart of this effort, and connecting their stories to the cause could make a powerful impact. "I'll need to talk to the families first," she said carefully. "We can't pressure them into anything, but if they're willing, it could really make a difference." Dean nodded, his expression earnest. "That's all I'm asking. Let's give the donors a reason to care, something they can't ignore." Juliet agreed, though her mind was already racing with logistics. As the meeting wrapped up, she couldn't help but feel a growing tension between her gratitude for Dean's support and her nagging suspicion that he was hiding something. But for now, she set those doubts aside. The children needed her focus, and the event was fast approaching. Juliet walked through the hospital's pediatric oncology ward, her clipboard in hand as she checked off her morning tasks. Despite the usual bustle of nurses and soft hum of medical equipment, her thoughts were elsewhere, focused on Dean's suggestion from the previous day. Featuring the children's stories at the fundraiser was a bold idea, and while she knew it could strike an emotional chord with donors, she was equally aware of the delicate line they'd have to walk. She stopped by Caleb's room first. The 8-year-old was busy drawing in his sketchbook again, this time sketching what looked like a sidekick for Captain Courage. His face lit up when Juliet stepped inside. "Hey, Miss Juliet! Look, Captain Courage has a new friend," he exclaimed, holding up the page proudly. Juliet smiled, kneeling beside his bed to get a better look. "Wow, who's this?" "This is Bright Star. She helps Captain Courage when things get really tough," Caleb explained, his voice brimming with enthusiasm. "They're going to save everyone together." Juliet's heart ached at the simplicity and purity of his optimism. "I think she's amazing. You're quite the storyteller, Caleb." "Do you think people would like to see my superheroes?" he asked, his tone suddenly shy. "I could draw more for them." Juliet hesitated, her mind turning over the possibilities. Caleb's drawings could be a perfect way to involve the children without putting too much pressure on them. "I think they'd love it," she said gently. "Why don't you work on a few more? Maybe we can show them off at the fundraiser." Caleb's grin was answer enough, and Juliet left his room with a spark of hope. She continued her rounds, quietly gauging the family's openness to participating in the event. Most were hesitant at first, but the more she explained, the more receptive they became. Sharing their stories was an act of trust, and Juliet was determined to ensure it was handled with the utmost care. By the afternoon, she had enough positive responses to move forward. She met Flora and Dot in the staff break room to go over the details, spreading her notes across the table. "Caleb's on board," Juliet said, pointing to a section in her notebook. "He's even planning to draw some superhero sketches for the event. A few of the other kids have agreed to share their stories too. I think it's coming together." "That's fantastic," Flora said, her excitement evident. "It'll add so much heart to the fundraiser." Dot tapped a finger on the table, her expression thoughtful. "We'll need to handle this carefully. The last thing we want is for the families to feel like we're exploiting their pain." "Agreed," Juliet said firmly. "This has to come from them, their voices, their terms. We're just giving them the platform." Dot nodded approvingly, but there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. "And Dean? How's he handling all this?" Juliet hesitated, unsure how to answer. Dean had been instrumental in securing donors and auction items, but his guarded nature continued to nag at her. "He's helping. A lot, actually, but I still don't know much about him." "Maybe that's a good thing," Dot said. "Sometimes it's better not to question the hand that feeds." Juliet wasn't so sure. As much as she wanted to trust Dean, her instincts told her there was more to his story, and she wasn't the type to ignore her instincts. The next day, Juliet found herself standing in front of the hospital's small conference room, a projector and laptop set up for a meeting with the participating families. It had taken hours to coordinate schedules, but she finally managed to gather the parents who had agreed to share their children's stories for the fundraiser. She smoothed her hands over her clipboard, glancing at the images and notes she'd prepared. When the families began to file in, Juliet greeted each of them warmly. Caleb's mother, a kind woman with tired eyes but a strong smile, was one of the first to arrive, carrying a folder of Caleb's superhero sketches. Soon, the room was filled with quiet conversations, parents whispering reassurances to one another as they settled into their seats. "Thank you all for coming," Juliet began, her voice steady but heartfelt. "I know this isn't easy, and I want you to know how much I appreciate your willingness to share your stories." The goal of this fundraiser is to help keep the oncology ward running, and we can't do that without showing people just how important it is. She clicked to the first slide on the projector. A collage of photos from the ward. Children laughing, parents sitting beside hospital beds, nurses reading stories to their patients. These moments, your moments, are what we want to share. You don't have to reveal anything you're not comfortable with. This is your story, and we'll follow your lead. The room fell silent for a moment before Caleb's mother raised her hand. Caleb's excited to contribute, she said, holding up the folder. He's been working on these non-stop. I think it's helped him feel like he's part of something bigger than himself. Juliet smiled warmly. That's exactly the kind of impact we want to make. Thank you for trusting us with this. Other parents began to speak up, sharing bits of their own stories and suggesting ways to present them. Some agreed to record short video messages with their children, while others offered written letters or photographs. By the end of the meeting, Juliet felt a sense of collective determination among the group. This wasn't just a fundraiser anymore. It was a testament to the strength and resilience of their community. After the meeting, Juliet stepped outside to gather her thoughts. The sky was overcast, the air heavy with the promise of rain. She hadn't realized how deeply the family's stories would affect her until she'd heard them firsthand. Their courage and vulnerability were humbling, and she felt an even greater responsibility to ensure the fundraiser succeeded. As she leaned against the railing, her phone buzzed. It was another text from Dean. I've secured 2 more high-profile items for the auction. Can we meet tonight to discuss? Juliet sighed, her curiosity about Dean's network growing with every passing day. He was undeniably resourceful, but the lack of transparency continued to gnaw at her. Still, his contributions were invaluable, and she couldn't afford to turn him away. A few hours later, they met again at the same cafe. Dean was already there when she arrived, a laptop open in front of him. This time his demeanor was more intense, his usual easy charm replaced with a sharper focus. Good news, he said as she sat down. I've managed to secure a weekend yacht retreat and a signed guitar from a Grammy-winning artist. Both are guaranteed to draw high bids. Juliet's eyebrows shot up. That's incredible. How did you manage that? Dean's lips curved into a faint smile. Let's just say I know people who like to stay in the shadows, but are willing to contribute when it's for a good cause. The answer was as vague as ever, and Juliet didn't bother hiding her skepticism. You have some very generous connections, Dean. Almost too generous. Dean leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. I get it. You're wondering why someone like me is going out of their way to help. The truth is, I've been where these families are. Not exactly the same, but close enough. Juliet blinked, caught off guard by the personal admission. What do you mean? Dean hesitated, his expression flickering between guarded and vulnerable. My mum. She was sick for a long time when I was a kid. We didn't have the resources these families do now, and it... He trailed off, shaking his head. It didn't end well. So when I see these kids fighting, and their parents doing everything they can, I can't just stand by. Juliet felt her defenses soften. For all his mystery, Dean's sincerity was undeniable in that moment. I'm sorry, she said quietly. And thank you for sharing that. I didn't realize... Dean waved it off, his tone brisk but not unkind. It's not about me, it's about them. Now, let's make sure this event does what it's supposed to. They spent the next hour finalizing details for the auction and mapping out how to incorporate the family's contributions. By the time they wrapped up, Juliet felt a renewed sense of purpose and a growing respect for the man across the table. As she drove home, her mind swirled with a mix of emotions. Dean's story had added another layer to the puzzle of who he was, but it had also revealed a depth she hadn't expected. For the first time, she began to see him not just as an enigma, but as someone who carried his own scars. And while her questions about his connections remained unanswered, she couldn't deny that his heart was in the right place. Juliet stepped into the brightly lit office of Robert Crowley, her shoulders squared despite the tension buzzing in the air. She hadn't wanted to make this meeting, but Dr. Carter had insisted. If there was even the slimmest chance of securing a partnership with Crowley's pharmaceutical company, it was worth exploring. The man behind the desk greeted her with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. His slicked-back hair and tailored suit screamed corporate precision, and Juliet couldn't shake the feeling that every word he spoke was calculated. "Miss Harper," Crowley said smoothly, extending a hand. "I've heard a lot about the work you've been doing at Austin Children's Hospital. It's admirable, truly." Juliet shook his hand briefly, her grip firm. "Thank you. I'm here because the oncology ward is in critical need of funding and resources. We're looking for partners who can help us continue providing care to the children who need it most." Crowley gestured for her to sit, his expression unreadable. "Of course. At Crowley Pharmaceuticals, we take pride in our commitment to community health. I'd like to see how we might assist." Juliet handed him a folder containing the hospital's financial projections and the fundraiser's objectives. As he skimmed through the documents, she studied his face, trying to gauge his reaction. He nodded occasionally, his lips pressed into a thin line. "This is all very compelling," he said finally, closing the folder. "And I believe we can help. But naturally there are terms we'd need to discuss." Juliet's stomach tightened. "Terms?" Crowley leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "We'd be willing to provide substantial funding to the oncology ward, as well as supply discounted medications. However, in exchange, we'd require exclusivity. That means the hospital would source all oncology-related pharmaceuticals exclusively from us." The words hit Juliet like a cold slap. She leaned forward, her tone sharp. "Exclusivity? That would limit our treatment options and tie the hospital's hands. We can't compromise the quality of care for the sake of convenience." Crowley's smile didn't waver. "It's not about convenience, Miss Harper. It's about partnership. With our resources and expertise, your ward could thrive. But business is business, and we need assurances that our investment is mutually beneficial." Juliet's fists clenched in her lap, her mind racing. His proposal wasn't just unethical, it was a trap. Agreeing to such terms would put the hospital at the mercy of Crowley Pharmaceuticals, sacrificing the very integrity of their care. "I appreciate your offer," she said carefully, keeping her voice steady, "but I don't believe it aligns with the hospital's mission." Crowley's expression hardened, his tone growing cooler. "Think it over, Miss Harper. Sometimes sacrifices are necessary for survival." Juliet stood, her heart pounding. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Crowley. I'll share your proposal with the board." As she walked out of the office, her mind was a whirlwind of anger and determination. Crowley's offer might have been tempting on the surface, but she couldn't let him dictate the future of the ward. She pulled out her phone, dialing Dr. Carter as she made her way to the parking lot. "We need to regroup," she said the moment he picked up. "Crowley's terms are a no-go. We'll have to make the fundraiser work without him." The next morning, Juliet sat in the hospital's staff lounge with Dr. Carter, Flora, and Dot, recounting the details of her meeting with Crowley. The frustration was evident in her tone as she laid out the pharmaceutical executive's demands. "It's nothing more than a power play," she concluded, setting her coffee mug down with a thud. "If we agree to his terms, we're putting the entire ward's future in his hands. It's not worth it." Dr. Carter nodded gravely. "You made the right call, Juliet. We can't afford to sacrifice the integrity of our care for a quick fix. Still, it's a blow. We were counting on his support." Dot, ever the pragmatist, tapped her pen against her clipboard. Then we doubled down on the fundraiser. With the sponsorship Dean secured and the auction items coming together, we still have a shot. Flora leaned forward, her expression serious but hopeful. What about the stories from the families? If we can frame them right, we might be able to sway some donors who've been on the fence. Juliet nodded. That's the plan. I've already spoken to several parents, and they're willing to participate. Caleb's mum is even putting together a short video highlighting his drawings. It's heartfelt without being overly heavy. Dr. Carter leaned back in his chair, a faint smile breaking through the tension on his face. Good. Let's focus on what we can control. Crowley's deal may have been a setback, but we've got momentum on our side. Juliet left the meeting feeling a renewed sense of purpose. There was no denying the challenges ahead, but she knew they couldn't afford to falter. As she made her way back to the ward, her phone buzzed with a text from Dean. "Call me when you have a minute. There's something we need to talk about." She stepped into an empty office, her pulse quickening as she dialed his number. He picked up on the second ring. "Juliet," he said, his voice steady. "How did it go with Crowley?" "As expected," she replied curtly. "He wanted exclusivity in exchange for funding. I turned him down." Dean let out a low whistle. "Good call. Guys like him only care about control. But it sounds like the fundraiser is still on track." "It is," she said, her tone softening slightly. "We're pulling everything together. The sponsorship and auction items are helping. But there's still a lot riding on this." Dean hesitated, his voice dropping slightly. "I might have a way to boost the auction's reach. It's a bit unconventional, but it could work. Can we meet later to discuss?" Juliet's curiosity piqued, though her wariness lingered. "Fine. Let's talk later. But no surprises, Dean. I've had enough of those for 1 week." "Understood," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "See you soon." As she hung up, Juliet couldn't help but wonder what Dean had in mind. Whatever it was, it needed to count. The stakes were too high for anything less. The evening sky was streaked with ominous grey clouds as Juliet arrived at the park where the charity concert was set to take place. Volunteers bustled around the open-air stage, setting up lights and sound equipment, while vendors arranged their tables along the perimeter. The air hummed with the anticipation of the event, but Juliet couldn't shake the knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. Every detail had to go perfectly tonight. This was their first big push to draw attention and funding to the hospital. She scanned the growing crowd, searching for familiar faces. Flora waved from a booth near the stage, where she was helping to organize a raffle. Dot stood by a table laden with brochures and donation forms, chatting warmly with attendees as they stopped by. Seeing her friends in action gave Juliet a momentary sense of relief, but it was fleeting. The pressure of the night loomed large. "Juliet!" Dean's voice cut through the din, and she turned to see him striding toward her, his confident demeanor somehow grounding amidst the chaos. "Dean!" she greeted, her tone brisk. "Everything's on schedule for now, but I have a feeling this weather isn't going to cooperate." He glanced at the darkening sky, his expression thoughtful. "Let's hope it holds off. But either way, people are showing up. That's what matters." Juliet nodded, trying to channel some of his calm. "Did you bring the auction items?" "Right here." He gestured toward a small team unloading boxes from a sleek black SUV. "Everything's accounted for, including the signed guitar and the weekend yacht retreat. They're setting up the display now." "Good." Juliet let out a slow breath. "Thank you, Dean. I know I've said it before, but this wouldn't be happening without you." Dean shrugged, his expression softening. "You're the one driving this, Juliet. I'm just helping where I can." Before she could respond, the sound of feedback from the stage microphone drew their attention. A local band was starting to play, their lively music cutting through the growing wind. The crowd began to gather closer to the stage, a mix of families, donors, and curious onlookers. Juliet's heart swelled with a flicker of hope. Maybe tonight would be a success after all. As the evening progressed, more attendees arrived, filling the park with laughter and conversation. Juliet moved between stations, checking on volunteers and answering questions from donors. Each interaction reminded her of what was at stake: the children who relied on the oncology ward, the families who fought alongside them, and the hospital staff who refused to give up. But as the first raffle was announced, a cold gust of wind swept through the park, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of rain. Juliet froze, her eyes darting to the horizon where storm clouds were rolling in fast. A sense of dread settled over her as she felt the first drops hit her skin. The rain started as a light drizzle, barely noticeable at first, but within minutes it grew into a steady downpour. Umbrellas popped open across the park as attendees scrambled for cover. Juliet rushed toward the stage, her shoes sinking slightly into the damp grass. The lead singer of the band exchanged a quick glance with her before speaking into the microphone. "Looks like the weather's not on our side, folks," he said with a laugh, his voice amplified over the speakers. "But we're not letting a little rain stop us." The crowd cheered in response, though Juliet could sense their hesitation. People were already drifting toward the exits, their enthusiasm dampened by the worsening weather. She clenched her fists, frustration mounting. This event was supposed to be a turning point, a rallying cry for their cause. Instead, it was unraveling before her eyes. Dean appeared at her side, his coat already soaked through. "We need to make an announcement," he said, raising his voice over the rain. "Tell people to stay for the auction. Remind them why they're here." Juliet hesitated, her mind racing. She wanted to believe that a heartfelt plea could salvage the night. But the rain was relentless, and the crowd's energy was fading fast. Still, she nodded, her determination overriding her doubts. "I'll do it." Dean followed her to the stage, shielding her with his umbrella as they climbed the steps. The band handed her the microphone, and she turned to face the thinning crowd, her heart pounding. "Good evening, everyone," Juliet began, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "I know this isn't the night we all hoped for, but I want to thank you for being here. Your support means more than I can say, not just to me, but to the children and families who rely on the oncology ward at Austin Children's Hospital." She paused, scanning the faces in the audience. Some were listening intently, while others lingered at the edges, unsure whether to stay or go. Juliet pressed on. "This isn't just a fundraiser," she said, her voice growing stronger. "It's a chance to make a real difference in the lives of children who are fighting battles most of us can't imagine. Every donation, every bid in tonight's auction brings us one step closer to giving them the care they deserve." A ripple of applause broke out, tentative but encouraging. Juliet's chest tightened with a mix of relief and urgency. "The rain might have caught us off guard," she continued, "but it doesn't change our mission. So I invite you to stay, enjoy the evening, and join us in making hope a reality." Dean stepped forward, taking the microphone briefly. "And for those of you who do stay, I'll personally match every dollar raised in the auction tonight," he announced, his voice cutting through the rain. Gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd, followed by a louder wave of applause. Juliet turned to him, her eyes wide with surprise, but Dean simply gave her a faint smile before stepping back. As the music resumed, the energy in the park began to shift. Though some attendees still left, a significant number stayed, gathering closer to the stage and auction area. Juliet watched as volunteers moved quickly to cover displays and redirect the focus of the event. It wasn't the flawless evening she had envisioned, but for the first time that night, Hope flickered once again. The morning after the rain-soaked fundraiser, Juliet sat at her small kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. Her phone rested in front of her, buzzing occasionally with messages from Flora, Dot, and Dr. Carter. Each text brought updates on the auction's results, but Juliet hadn't yet summoned the courage to open them. The disappointment of the previous night still hung heavy in her chest, despite the efforts they had made to salvage the event. She exhaled slowly, finally unlocking her phone. The first message from Flora caught her attention immediately. "Final numbers are in. Call me." With a mix of anticipation and dread, Juliet dialed. Flora answered on the second ring, her voice practically bursting with excitement. "Juliet, you won't believe this. We raised over double what we expected." Juliet blinked, caught off guard. "Double? Even after the rain?" "Especially after the rain," Flora said with a laugh. "Dean's matching pledge made a huge difference, and some of the bigger auction items went for way more than we thought. The signed guitar alone brought in nearly $10,000. Juliet leaned back in her chair, a wave of relief washing over her. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel a spark of genuine hope. "That's incredible," she said softly. "I can't believe it." "You'd better believe it," Flora replied. "Dot's already talking to some of the donors about additional partnerships, and Miguel's article is going viral. People are starting to take notice." Juliet thanked Flora and ended the call, her mind racing. She couldn't deny the impact Dean had made, not just with his contributions, but with his bold offer to match the donations. His actions had reignited the momentum they so desperately needed. Yet, as grateful as she was, questions about his mysterious connections and sudden generosity still lingered. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Frowning, she stood and peered through the peephole, her surprise deepening when she saw Dean standing there, a casual jacket slung over his arm. She opened the door cautiously. "Morning," he said, offering a small smile. "I figured I'd stop by and see how you're holding up after last night." Juliet crossed her arms, her expression a mix of gratitude and curiosity. "You mean after you swooped in and saved the night?" Dean chuckled, stepping inside when she motioned for him to enter. "I wouldn't call it that. Everyone played their part." She gestured toward the table. "Coffee? Or is it too early for you?" "I'll take a cup," Dean said, sitting down as she moved to the counter. He glanced at the papers scattered across the table, notes from the fundraiser, a draft of the hospital's updated budget, and a handwritten thank you letter from one of the families. "Looks like you've been busy." Juliet poured him a cup and set it in front of him. "Busy doesn't even cover it. But it's good news. The fundraiser exceeded expectations." "That's great to hear," Dean said, his tone warm but measured. "I had a feeling people would rally behind the cause once they saw how much it mattered." Juliet studied him for a moment, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Dean, why do you care so much?" "You've done more for this fundraiser than anyone could have expected, but I still don't know why." Dean's gaze dropped to his coffee, his expression momentarily guarded. "I told you before. I've seen what it's like when people don't have access to the care they need. This is my way of making sure others don't have to go through what I did." Juliet nodded slowly, sensing there was more to his story, but deciding not to press him. For now, his actions spoke louder than any explanation. Dean sipped his coffee, his gaze distant for a moment before he set the mug down. "There's something else I need to tell you," he said, his voice quieter now. "Last night wasn't just about raising money. It was about proving to people that this is a cause worth investing in. The auction may have been a success, but it's just the start." Juliet tilted her head, watching him closely. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. The people who donated last night are part of a larger network. They're movers and shakers, the kind of people who can bring in even more funding if we can show them results. If we play this right, we could secure ongoing support for the oncology ward, not just a one-time boost. Juliet's heart skipped at the prospect, though she couldn't help feeling wary. That sounds promising, but also risky. What if they lose interest? Dean's expression didn't waver. That's why it's critical we follow through on everything we promised. We need to show them exactly how their money is making a difference. Updates on the ward, stories from the families, anything that proves this isn't just another charity pitch. Juliet nodded slowly, her mind already turning to the logistics. That means putting together reports, photos, maybe even hosting follow-up events. Exactly, Dean said. And I'll help however I can. I've already spoken to a couple of the bigger donors. They're open to the idea of additional contributions if the ward starts seeing tangible improvements. Her skepticism flared again, though she kept her tone neutral. You've done a lot for this already, Dean. Why not just make a donation yourself and move on? Why stay involved? Dean met her eyes, the intensity in his gaze softening slightly. Because this is personal for me, more personal than I've let on. Juliet's breath hitched, her instincts telling her this was a moment she needed to tread carefully. You've hinted at that before. Is it about your mother? Dean nodded, his jaw tightening. She fought cancer for years. We didn't have much growing up, and by the time she needed serious care, it was too late. Watching her slip away without the help she deserved, it's something I'll never forget. I can't change what happened to her, but I can make sure other families don't have to go through that. The rawness in his voice caught Juliet off guard. For all his polished confidence, there was a vulnerability beneath it that she hadn't expected. Dean, she said softly, I'm sorry. I didn't know. He gave her a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. It's not something I talk about often, but seeing what you're doing here, it reminded me why it matters. The room fell quiet for a moment, the weight of his confession hanging between them. Juliet felt a strange mix of emotions, gratitude for his support, respect for his resilience, and a deepening sense of trust that surprised her. I think we can do this, she said finally, her voice steady. With your help, we can take this further than I ever imagined. Dean's smile grew, and this time it was genuine. That's what I like to hear. As they began mapping out their next steps, Juliet couldn't help but feel that the fundraiser had been more than just a success. It had been the beginning of something far bigger. And while the path ahead was uncertain, she knew they weren't walking it alone. The weeks leading up to the charity gala were a whirlwind of activity. Juliet found herself immersed in details she hadn't considered before: seating charts, menu tastings, lighting arrangements, all while balancing her shifts at the hospital. It was exhausting but oddly exhilarating, the constant movement keeping her from dwelling too long on what was at stake. The gala was set to be held at the Marlowe estate, an elegant venue that Dean's mysterious sponsor had secured. The sprawling grounds and crystal chandeliers provided an air of sophistication that Juliet hoped would impress the donors. Yet, despite the progress, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The event was polished, yes, but it needed a personal touch to remind attendees why they were there. Stories, Dean had said during one of their planning sessions. That's what will set this apart. People need to see the faces behind the cause. That thought stayed with Juliet as she worked late into the night, finalizing the program. Several families from the oncology ward had already agreed to participate, offering photos, video clips, and even short testimonials. Caleb's sketches, now bound into a small booklet titled Superheroes of Hope, would be handed out to every attendee. It was a gesture Juliet hoped would bridge the gap between numbers on a spreadsheet and the lives those numbers represented. As the day of the gala approached, tension among the team reached a fever pitch. Flora and Dot had taken on the monumental task of coordinating with vendors and ensuring every detail was perfect. Miguel, true to his word, had penned an article promoting the event, drawing attention from the city's social and philanthropic circles. Even Dr. Carter, usually composed, seemed to be running on adrenaline as he reviewed last-minute logistics. Through it all, Dean remained an enigma. He was always present, always helpful, but Juliet could sense he was holding something back. Whether it was about his connections or his personal stake in the fundraiser, she wasn't sure. What she did know was that his involvement had been indispensable, and for that she was grateful, even if it came with unanswered questions. The morning of the gala, Juliet arrived at the Marlowe estate early, wanting to see the venue before the chaos of the evening set in. The main hall was breathtaking, with its high ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed the room in natural light. Tables adorned with elegant centerpieces lined the room, while a stage at one end stood ready for the evening's speeches and performances. As she walked through the space, Juliet's phone buzzed. It was a text from Dean. "Everything's on track. Call me if you need anything." She smiled faintly, slipping the phone back into her pocket. Despite her lingering doubts about him, she couldn't deny that Dean had become someone she relied on. Tonight would be the ultimate test, not just of their efforts, but of the trust she'd placed in him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the Marlowe estate transformed into a beacon of light and energy. Guests began arriving in sleek cars, dressed in glittering evening gowns and tailored suits, their conversations a mix of curiosity and excitement. Juliet stood at the entrance, greeting attendees with a warm smile that masked the nerves twisting in her stomach. Flora joined her, a clipboard in hand and an air of determination. "The auction items are set up, and the catering team is ready. Dot's with the families, making sure everyone's comfortable." Juliet nodded, scanning the growing crowd. "Good. Let's keep things smooth. We can't afford any hiccups tonight." As the last of the arrivals filtered inside, Juliet made her way to the main hall. The atmosphere was electric, the murmur of voices blending with the soft notes of a string quartet. Guests lingered near the auction displays, admiring items that ranged from luxury vacations to handcrafted art. Caleb's booklet, placed on each table, had already sparked conversations, and Juliet caught snippets of attendees marveling at his creativity. On stage, Dr. Carter adjusted the microphone and cleared his throat. The room gradually quieted, and all eyes turned toward him. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight," he began, his voice steady and warm. "Your presence here is more than just an act of generosity. It's a declaration of hope for the children who depend on Austin Children's Hospital." Applause rippled through the crowd, and Juliet felt a swell of pride. Dr. Carter continued, sharing statistics about the oncology ward's impact before inviting one of the families to speak. Caleb's mother stepped onto the stage, holding the booklet her son had worked so hard on. Her voice trembled at first, but as she recounted Caleb's journey and the support they'd received from the hospital, the room fell silent. "When Caleb was diagnosed," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "we thought we'd lost all hope, but thanks to the care and compassion of the oncology team, he's not just surviving, he's thriving. And that's why we're here tonight, to make sure no family has to face this journey alone." The applause that followed was thunderous, and Juliet blinked back tears. This was why they had worked so hard, to give a voice to families like Caleb's and ensure their stories inspired action. As the evening progressed, the auction began. Dean took the lead, his charisma and sharp wit captivating the audience as he introduced each item. Bids flew in quickly, some items fetching far more than their estimated value. The signed guitar sold for $15,000, while the weekend yacht retreat sparked a heated bidding war that ended at $25,000. Juliet couldn't help but marvel at how seamlessly Dean navigated the room, his every word drawing attention and enthusiasm. By the time the final item was sold, the energy in the room was palpable. Guests mingled over dessert, their conversations animated with talk of the hospital's work and the lives they were helping to change. Juliet took a moment to step outside, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the bustling hall. Dean found her there, his hands tucked into his pockets as he approached. "You did it," he said simply. Juliet shook her head, a tired but genuine smile on her lips. "We did it. None of this would have been possible without you." He shrugged, a faint smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "I'm just glad it worked. The numbers look good, by the way. We'll have the exact total soon, but I think we've exceeded even the best-case scenario." Juliet exhaled deeply, the weight of the evening finally lifting. "Thank you, Dean, for everything." His expression softened, and for a moment she thought he might say something more. But before he could, the sound of applause from inside drew their attention. "Looks like they're calling for you," he said, motioning toward the door. Juliet hesitated before heading back in, glancing over her shoulder as she did. Dean stood in the shadows, his gaze following her with a mix of pride and something else she couldn't quite place. Whatever his secrets, she knew one thing for certain. Tonight had been a victory, and they were one step closer to saving the ward. The aftermath of the gala was a mix of exhaustion and elation. The total amount raised surpassed all expectations, and the oncology ward now had enough funding to secure its future for at least another 2 years. Juliet sat in Dr. Carter's office the following morning, reviewing the final numbers with him and Flora. The mood was triumphant, but Juliet couldn't shake the undercurrent of unease that had lingered since the gala. "This is more than we hoped for," Dr. Carter said, his smile broad as he tapped the final report. "The hospital board will be thrilled, and the donors, they've set the stage for something long-lasting." Flora leaned back in her chair, grinning. "I've already had 3 calls this morning asking when the next event is. Looks like we've got a reputation now." Juliet chuckled lightly, though her mind was elsewhere. She replayed the night in her head, Dean's commanding presence at the auction, the heartfelt stories shared by the families, and the undeniable impact the event had made. It had been a success, but something still didn't add up. Dean's connections were far too convenient, his resources far too vast. And while she trusted his intentions, she couldn't ignore the lingering questions about who he really was. "Juliet?" Dr. Carter's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "You've done an extraordinary job. I hope you're taking some time for yourself after all this." "I will," she said, forcing a smile, "but there's still a lot to follow up on." Dr. Carter gave her a knowing look, but didn't press further. As the meeting wrapped up, Juliet stepped out into the hallway, her phone buzzing with a text from Miguel. "Call me ASAP, something's come up." Her stomach tightened. Miguel's tone in his articles was usually light and upbeat, but this message carried a sense of urgency she couldn't ignore. She found a quiet corner and dialed his number. "Juliet," Miguel answered on the first ring, "I've been doing some digging into the donors from last night. You're not going to believe what I found." "What is it?" she asked, her pulse quickening. "One of the biggest contributors? The one who secured the yacht retreat and the concert tickets? They're tied to a shell company. The name's been linked to some questionable dealings." Juliet's blood ran cold. "Questionable how?" "Money laundering, fraud, you name it," Miguel said. "It's all speculation at this point, but the connections are too strong to ignore. And there's more. Dean Cross is listed as one of the company's directors." Juliet's breath caught. "What? That can't be right." "I triple-checked," Miguel said grimly. "It's him. I don't know what he's involved in, but you need to be careful." Juliet ended the call, her mind spinning. The success of the gala now felt like a shadowed triumph, tainted by this revelation. Dean had been instrumental in their efforts, but if Miguel's information was accurate, his involvement could jeopardize everything they'd worked for. Juliet paced the length of her living room, Miguel's words replaying in her mind like a broken record. She couldn't reconcile the Dean she knew, the man who had gone out of his way to save the oncology ward, with the image Miguel had painted. A director of a shell company tied to illicit dealings. It didn't fit, but the evidence was too specific to ignore. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was Dean. The message was short and direct. "Can we meet? There's something I need to explain." Juliet's heart raced. Part of her wanted to ignore the text, to avoid whatever confrontation lay ahead, but she knew she couldn't. If there was any truth to Miguel's findings, she had to hear Dean's side of the story, no matter how difficult it might be. 15 minutes later, they were seated at a quiet cafe, the same one where so many of their discussions had begun. Dean looked as composed as ever, but Juliet noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his hands rested tightly on the table. "I got your message," she said, her tone even. "What's going on?" Dean hesitated, his gaze flickering to the window before returning to hers. "I know you've probably heard something by now. Miguel's the type who doesn't let things go." Juliet leaned forward, her voice sharp. "So it's true? Your connection to that company. What does it mean, Dean? Were you using the fundraiser for some ulterior motive?" His jaw tightened further, and he exhaled slowly. "Number, absolutely not. Everything I've done for the ward, for the hospital, has been genuine. But yes, I was connected to that company. It's part of my past, something I've been trying to leave behind." Juliet's hands curled into fists under the table. "You're going to have to do better than that, Dean. The hospital's reputation, the ward's future, it's all tied to the donors you brought in. If there's any chance this blows back on us, I need to know." Dean's expression softened, though his voice remained firm. "I didn't lie to you, Juliet. What Miguel found is a half-truth. The company was my father's. When he passed, I inherited the title and the mess that came with it. I didn't know the full extent of what he'd been involved in until it was too late." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "I spent years cleaning it up, cutting ties, and doing everything I could to distance myself. But no matter how much good I try to do, that name keeps following me." Juliet searched his face, looking for any sign of deception. What she saw instead was raw honesty, a vulnerability he rarely showed. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I didn't want it to overshadow what we were doing," he said, his voice low. "I didn't want you or the hospital to suffer because of my past." Juliet's emotions warred within her, anger, understanding, doubt, and something dangerously close to sympathy. "Dean, if this gets out, it could undo everything we've worked for." "I know," he said quietly, "and I'll take full responsibility if it does. But I swear to you, Juliet, my intentions were pure. I wanted to help because I believe in what you're doing, and because I believe in you." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Juliet stared at him, her heart pounding. She didn't know if she could fully trust him, but she also couldn't deny the impact he had made. "We'll need to be careful," she said at last, her voice steady. "And transparent. If there's any fallout, we face it head-on. Together." Dean nodded, relief flickering across his face. Together. As they left the cafe, Juliet knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. Dean's revelations had added a new layer of complexity to their fight for the ward, but she also sensed that his support, however complicated, was far from over. The days following Dean's confession were a whirlwind of damage control and preparation. Juliet had immediately convened a meeting with Dr. Carter and Flora, carefully explaining the potential risks tied to one of their major donors. While she didn't reveal Dean's full connection to the issue, she was transparent about the situation, emphasizing their need for a proactive approach. "We have to get ahead of this," Juliet said, her tone resolute. "If anyone questions the legitimacy of the donations or the fundraiser, we need to have answers ready." Dr. Carter frowned, his fingers steepled in thought. "What's the likelihood of this becoming public?" Juliet hesitated, glancing at Flora, who had been uncharacteristically quiet. "Miguel said it's mostly speculation at this point, but if someone digs deeper, it could surface. We can't ignore the possibility." Flora finally spoke, her voice firm. "Then, we focus on the results. The fundraiser wasn't about the donors, it was about saving the ward. If we can show where the money is going and the lives it's helping, that's what people will care about." Dr. Carter nodded slowly. "Agreed. Transparency will be key. Juliet, I trust you to lead the charge on this." Though the conversation left Juliet with a sense of responsibility heavier than she'd ever carried, it also strengthened her resolve. They had worked too hard and come too far to let doubt or controversy undermine their efforts. Later that day, Juliet returned to the oncology ward, her steps quick but deliberate as she moved between patients. Caleb greeted her with his usual enthusiasm, holding up another superhero sketch. "This one's for you," he announced proudly. Juliet knelt beside him, taking the drawing with a smile. The superhero bore a striking resemblance to her, complete with a stethoscope and a determined expression. "What's her name?" she asked. "Hope," Caleb said simply, "because that's what you give people." The word hit Juliet with unexpected force, and she blinked quickly to hold back tears. "Thank you, Caleb. This means more to me than you know." She left his room feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew why she was fighting and who she was fighting for. By evening, Juliet found herself back at the cafe where so much had unfolded. Dean was already there, his expression unreadable as he watched her approach. They hadn't spoken since his confession, and the weight of unspoken words hung heavily between them. "How are things on your end?" Juliet asked as she sat down. Dean gave a small shrug. "I've been reaching out to the donors I brought in, making sure they're aware of what might come out. So far, no one's pulled their support." "That's good," Juliet said, though her tone was cautious. "But it's not just about the donors. We have to protect the hospital's reputation too." Dean nodded, his gaze steady. "I'll do whatever it takes to make sure this doesn't hurt you, or the ward. You have my word." Juliet studied him for a moment, torn between gratitude and lingering distrust. "We're in this together, Dean. But if we're going to make it work, I need full transparency from now on." "Understood," he said quietly. "No more secrets." Over the next few days, Juliet threw herself into the hospital's efforts to highlight the impact of the fundraiser. With Flora and Dot's help, they organized a media campaign that showcased the stories of the families benefiting from the oncology ward. Caleb's sketches were prominently featured in social media posts, alongside testimonials from parents and staff. Miguel's follow-up article emphasized the success of the gala, steering attention toward the ward's achievements and away from the murmurings about donor controversies. Despite the growing positivity, Juliet couldn't shake her anxiety. Every time her phone buzzed, she half expected it to be news of another inquiry or complication. She kept in constant contact with Dr. Carter and the hospital board, preparing them for any fallout. But so far, there had been no public backlash. One evening, as Juliet reviewed the latest draft of a donor report, her phone rang. It was Dean. "Any news?" she asked, skipping pleasantries. "Nothing yet. he replied, though his tone carried an edge of unease. But there's something else I wanted to discuss. I've been thinking about how we can take this further, turn the fundraiser into something more sustainable. Juliet set her pen down, intrigued despite her exhaustion. What do you mean? Last night I spoke to a few of the major donors again, Dean said. They're open to the idea of establishing an ongoing foundation for the oncology ward, something that could bring in steady funding year after year. Juliet's heart skipped at the prospect. A foundation? That's ambitious. It is, Dean admitted, but it's also necessary. The fundraiser was a huge success, but it's a short-term fix. A foundation would give the ward the stability it needs to thrive long-term. The idea was compelling, and Juliet couldn't deny the logic behind it. Yet her reservations about Dean's connections lingered. Who would oversee it? Who would manage the funds? That's where you come in, Dean said simply. The hospital would have full oversight. I'd help set it up, bring in the initial donors, and then step back. This isn't about me. It's about making sure the ward has a future. Juliet hesitated, her mind racing. It was an opportunity too important to dismiss outright, but she couldn't ignore the risks. Let me think about it, she said at last, and I'll need to run it by Dr. Carter and the board. Of course, Dean said, his voice steady. Take your time. Just know that I'm here to help, whatever you decide. As she hung up, Juliet stared at the notes scattered across her desk. Dean's offer had the potential to transform the ward's future, but it also carried the weight of his past. Trusting him meant taking a leap she wasn't sure she was ready for, but for the sake of the children she fought for every day, it might be a leap worth taking. The boardroom at Austin Children's Hospital buzzed with anticipation as Juliet stood at the head of the table, her notes spread neatly in front of her. The room was filled with familiar faces: Dr. Carter, Flora, Dot, and a few members of the hospital board, each wearing expressions that ranged from cautious optimism to outright skepticism. It was the culmination of weeks of effort, planning, and no small amount of uncertainty. Today, Juliet would present Dean's proposal for the foundation that could secure the oncology ward's future. Thank you all for being here, Juliet began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. I know we've faced a lot of challenges recently, but I also believe we've proven just how strong our community is. The success of the gala showed us what's possible when we come together, and I think we can take it even further. She paused, glancing at her notes before continuing. Dean Cross has proposed the creation of a dedicated foundation to provide ongoing funding for the oncology ward. This foundation would allow us to expand our resources, develop new programs, and ensure that no child is turned away due to financial constraints. Dr. Carter leaned forward, his hands clasped. And what about oversight? How do we ensure this foundation operates transparently and aligns with the hospital's mission? That's a priority, Juliet said firmly. The hospital would retain full control of the foundation's operations. Dean has agreed to help establish it, bring in the initial donors, and then step back entirely. His role will be strictly advisory during the setup phase. A murmur of approval rippled through the room, though one of the board members raised a hand. And what about the potential controversies surrounding some of the donors? Have we addressed the risks? Juliet took a deep breath, meeting their gazes head-on. We've already started addressing those concerns through proactive communication. Transparency is key, and we'll provide regular updates on how the funds are being used. More importantly, we'll focus on the impact the foundation will have on the children and families who depend on this ward. Dr. Carter nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. It's an ambitious idea, Juliet, but I believe it's one worth pursuing. The room fell silent as the board members exchanged glances. Finally, the chairwoman spoke. Let's move forward with the proposal. We'll begin drafting the framework for the foundation immediately. Relief washed over Juliet as the decision was made. It wasn't just a victory for the oncology ward, it was a testament to the power of resilience and teamwork. As the meeting adjourned, she felt a surge of gratitude for the people who had stood by her through every challenge. Later that evening, Juliet stood in the quiet of the oncology ward, watching Caleb and a few other children colour at the playroom table. Their laughter and chatter filled the space, a reminder of everything they had fought for. Dot appeared at her side, her warm smile as reassuring as ever. "You did it," Dot said softly. "The ward's future is secure." Juliet nodded, her eyes misting. "We all did it, and it's just the beginning." As Juliet walked through the ward, the sense of relief and accomplishment settled deeper with every step. The children's laughter, the sight of parents chatting with nurses, and the steady hum of care being provided, it was all a reminder of what they had saved. The foundation wasn't just an idea anymore. It was a promise to every family who would step through the hospital doors in the years to come. She made her way to the hospital's rooftop garden, a quiet space she often retreated to when she needed to think. The evening air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers. To her surprise, she found Dean there, leaning against the railing and looking out over the city skyline. "I thought you'd disappeared," Juliet said, her voice light but curious. Dean turned, his expression softening when he saw her. "Not quite. I wanted to give you some space after the meeting. Today was your moment." Juliet joined him at the railing, the city lights twinkling below. "It wasn't just mine. None of this would have been possible without you." Dean shook his head, a faint smile playing at his lips. "You're giving me too much credit. You were the one who held everything together, who convinced people to believe in something bigger than themselves." Juliet glanced at him, her tone turning serious. "Dean, I've been thinking a lot about what you told me, about your past. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand everything you've been through, but I want you to know that I trust you. Whatever comes next, I'm glad you're here." Dean's smile grew, and for a moment, the guardedness he so often carried seemed to fade. "That means more than you know," he said quietly. "I've spent so long trying to make up for my family's mistakes, but this feels different. Like I'm finally doing something that matters." "It does matter," Juliet said firmly. "And you do too." They stood in silence for a while, the weight of the past weeks giving way to a quiet sense of connection. For the first time, Juliet felt like the future, uncertain as it might be, was something she could face with hope. The next morning, Juliet returned to the ward, ready to dive into the work ahead. The foundation launch would take months of planning, but she felt more prepared than ever. As she greeted Caleb and the other children, she noticed one of his sketches pinned to the bulletin board. It was a new drawing depicting Captain Courage standing beside a new hero, Hope. Their capes billowed in the wind, and above them were the words, "Together we can save the world." Juliet smiled, her heart swelling with pride and determination. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but as she looked around at the faces of the children and families she'd fought for, she felt ready. They had built something stronger than just a fundraiser or a ward. They had built a community bound by hope and resilience, and together they would continue to save the world, one child at a time.